March 14th, 2008, Detroit, Michigan. The city is waking up. Factory workers clock in. Teachers file into classrooms. Nurses start their shifts. Somewhere across town, a retired auto worker named Gerald pours himself coffee and checks his bank account. His pension payment is late. It's never been late. He calls the fund administrator. A recorded message. He calls again. Same message. He drives down to the office on Woodward Avenue, the one with the blue awning and the American flag out front, and finds a handwritten note taped to the glass door. It says, "Temporarily closed." But temporarily is a lie. That office will never open again, and Gerald's pension, the retirement he spent 34 years earning, is gone. Not delayed, not frozen, gone. And Gerald is not alone. There are 6,200 people exactly like him. Combined, they are owed more than $500 million, money that was promised, money that was paid in. Money that, according to every record, every statement, every assurance they'd ever received, was sitting safely in a fund. It wasn't. What nobody knew yet, what would take federal investigators years to untangle, was that the man trusted to protect that money had been dismantling it, piece by piece, for nearly a decade. He had done it quietly, methodically, in plain sight. And by the time Gerald drove home and sat in his car in the driveway for 40 minutes because he didn't know how to tell his wife, the man responsible had already covered his tracks. The Midwest Municipal Retirement Collective had been sending quarterly statements for over a decade, clean, professional, reassuring. Every quarter, the fund reported steady gains, conservative investments, reliable returns, nothing flashy, nothing suspicious. Members trusted it because it was boring. And then on a Tuesday morning in March, it simply ceased to exist. Federal investigators would later describe what happened as one of the most methodical financial destructions they had ever encountered. Not a collapse, not a market failure. The money didn't evaporate in bad investments or risky trades. It was moved, deliberately, strategically, over years. By the time anyone noticed, the architect of the scheme was already gone. To understand what happened and why it could happen anywhere, you need to understand what a pension fund actually is. When a city worker clocks in every day, a percentage of their wages is automatically deducted. That money goes into a collective pool. It is legally protected. It is federally regulated. It belongs, irrevocably, to the workers who earned it. This is not an investment account. It is not a bonus program. It is deferred wages, money already earned, already owed. A board of trustees manages the fund. They hire investment managers. Those managers invest the pool conservatively, legally, and the fund grows over time. When a worker retires, they draw from that pool every month for the rest of their life. It is, in theory, one of the most protected financial instruments in the United States. Federal law mandates transparency, requires audits, demands that fund managers act in the interest of beneficiaries, not themselves. Breaking these rules is not just a civil violation, it is a federal crime. And yet it happens, more than most people know. In 2005, a Chicago investment manager convinced 3 separate municipal pension boards to invest in a real estate development that didn't exist. Total loss, $67 million. He fled to Panama. In a separate case, a pension consultant operating across multiple states fabricated annual returns for 11 years. The fund showed 7% growth on paper. In reality, it had lost money every single year. 3 separate audit firms signed off on it. Total shortfall, $240 million. Same pattern, each time, a trusted intermediary, a lack of real oversight, small irregularities ignored, and by the time the numbers couldn't be reconciled, the damage was irreversible. Detroit was both of these cases combined, and then some. For years, the Midwest Municipal Retirement Collective had been guided by a man its beneficiaries trusted completely. His photograph hung in the lobby. His biography described him as a tireless advocate for working families. He attended the appreciation dinners. He shook the hands. He signed the newsletters. Investigators would later discover he had already begun moving money long before anyone suspected anything. But in the early months of the investigation, they didn't yet know his name. They knew only that someone with deep access, someone who understood the fund's internal structure at a level very few people did, had been systematically rerouting its assets since 2001, 7 years before the collapse. What they could see was a pattern of breathtaking precision. Each transfer was sized carefully just beneath the threshold that would trigger automatic regulatory review. Each receiving entity was a real company, at least on paper. Each had a verifiable address, a registered agent, a tax ID number, but every company traced back to the same 4 post office boxes in 4 different states, under 4 different names. Someone had built a financial maze, and they had been walking through it, quietly, for years. The break came from an unlikely source, a photocopier. A low-level administrative assistant was cleaning out the fund's storage room, by now a federal crime scene, when she found a box of misfiled documents behind a broken cabinet. Inside were photocopies of wire transfer authorizations, hundreds of them. They weren't supposed to exist. Digital-only policy had been in place since 2003. Someone had been making physical copies and hiding them. Each document bore a signature, same signature, hundreds of times. The name on the signature line was Marcus Webb. Webb was not a rogue outsider. He was the fund's chief investment officer, appointed by the board in 1999, trusted unconditionally, praised annually in newsletters sent to every beneficiary. For 9 years, he had been systematically looting the people he was photographed alongside. The story broke on a Friday evening. By Monday morning, it was everywhere. Photographs emerged immediately. Webb at industry conferences, Webb shaking hands with city officials, Webb at a beneficiary appreciation dinner 3 months before the fund collapsed. The images hit differently now. Every smile, every handshake, recontextualized in an instant. A financial news segment pointed to something chilling. The warning signs had been there. Muted returns in certain quarters, administrative fees that had quietly doubled over 3 years. An investment allocation footnote that, to anyone who looked closely, described vehicles that didn't match any registered securities. Nobody had looked closely. The FBI opened an investigation. The Department of Labor deployed forensic accountants. Michigan's Attorney General promised on live television that no pension fraud case in state history would be prosecuted as aggressively. And 6,200 retirees sat in front of televisions and tried to understand how this had happened to them. The forensic team began reconstructing every transaction the fund had executed since 1999. Not just the suspicious ones, all of them. The deeper they went, the stranger the numbers became. Transfers appeared where no investments existed. Returns matched markets that had never moved. Entire quarters of reported performance were reconstructed from nothing fabricated figures, entered cleanly, that reconciled perfectly with manufactured supporting documents. Webb had not simply stolen the money. He had built a parallel financial reality. When the board reviewed fund performance, they were looking at a constructed world. Statements were accurate in format, plausible in content, and entirely fabricated in substance. The real investments existed. They just weren't performing the way the statements showed. And the gap between the real numbers and the reported numbers was filled every single quarter by fresh transfers from the fund's own assets. It was a pension fund eating itself, slowly, invisibly. And then investigators found something that changed everything. Certain transactions, the ones that had funneled money deepest into Webb's shell network, required dual authorization. Webb's signature was on every one, but so was someone else's. That someone else was a board member named Raymond Cross, 11 years on the fund's investment committee, a retired city finance director, a man with the expertise to understand exactly what he was authorizing. Investigators noted that Cross had purchased a vacation home in the Florida Keys in 2005, in cash, on a board member's stipend of $18,000 a year. 3 theories emerged. The first, Webb acted alone, manipulating records without anyone else's real knowledge. This was his defense team's position from the beginning. The second, Cross had known, possibly from the start. that his dual authorizations were not administrative rubber stamping, but active participation. The third theory was the most unsettling. Some investigators believed the fraud extended beyond the fund entirely, that certain financial institutions had knowingly structured transactions to obscure the money trail in exchange for fees. Two major banks were named in early investigative memos. Neither was ever charged. In November 2009, Marcus Webb pled guilty. The courtroom was packed. Retirees sat in the gallery in silence. Webb read a prepared statement. Failures of judgment. Profound remorse. His attorney described a man who had started small, gotten in too deep, and lost his way. The judge sentenced him to 14 years. The media called it justice. The FBI closed their active file. For 3 weeks, it felt like an ending. And then Raymond Cross's attorney made a phone call. Cross had kept records. Not just records, recordings. Since 2004, Cross had been recording his conversations, phone calls, in-person meetings, claiming he did so as personal protection. Evidence, he said, that if the scheme ever unraveled, he could prove he had been coerced. Whether that was true was almost beside the point. What mattered was what the recordings contained. On 17 audio files, Marcus Webb could be heard discussing the fund's real financial position with individuals who were not Raymond Cross, individuals who held positions at two major financial institutions, individuals who on the recordings asked clarifying questions, made suggestions. In one recording, one of them laughs. None of this had surfaced during Webb's prosecution. His plea deal had not required cooperation. He had pled guilty quickly, investigators now believed intentionally, before the broader network could be exposed. The case was not over. It had barely begun. Federal prosecutors subpoenaed records from both institutions. What emerged was a pattern that went far beyond Detroit. In exchange for directing pension assets into specific investment products, products the banks structured, products the banks profited from, the banks had provided benefits to fund managers across multiple states. Not crude cash payments, consulting contracts, conference invitations, employment arrangements for family members of fund trustees. Investigators compared pension fund performance data across 17 states. Funds managed by advisors with close institutional relationships had returned, on average, 2.3 percentage points less than comparable funds managed at arm's length. Over decades, across millions of beneficiaries, 2.3 percentage points is not a rounding error. It is hundreds of billions of dollars. On June 3, 2011, the Department of Justice unsealed indictments against 11 individuals. Webb faced additional charges. Cross was indicted for conspiracy and securities fraud. 2 financial executives were named. 4 intermediaries charged with wire fraud and racketeering. The largest pension fraud prosecution in American history. The presiding judge looked at the defendants and said, "The crime in this courtroom is not simply theft. It is the systematic betrayal of people who had no defense, people who worked, people who trusted, people who had no way of knowing that the system designed to protect them was the system being used against them." In the gallery, Gerald was sitting in the 3rd row. He did not react when the judge spoke. He just looked at his hands. Of the $500 million diverted, investigators recovered approximately $112 million. The rest, more than $380 million, was gone, transferred through foreign accounts, converted into assets long since resold or dissipated. Some of it simply could not be traced to any recoverable form. The Federal Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation stepped in, but its statutory limits meant many beneficiaries received less than 60 cents on the dollar. Gerald's monthly check, $2,100, before the collapse was reset to $1,240. He had a mortgage, a wife with a medical condition, no other income. He was 67 years old. Investigators documented the cascading damage across all 6,200 beneficiaries, mortgage defaults, medical coverage lapses, families exhausted helping elderly parents, and in 11 documented cases, deaths attributed by family members directly to the financial devastation. The human cost of financial crime is almost never counted in the same column as the dollar amount. It should be. Webb's sentence was extended to 22 years. Cross received 9, served 5. 2 financial executives, 1 convicted, 1 acquitted. The 2 banks entered civil settlements totaling $340 million in penalties without admitting wrongdoing. Both remained operational. Congress passed amendments strengthening pension fund disclosure requirements. Regulators called it progress. Critics called it inadequate. The problem, they said, was never the absence of rules. Rules had existed, audits had existed, oversight bodies had existed. None of it had stopped Detroit. Because the people inside the system had learned to speak its language perfectly in ways that looked, from every angle of inspection, exactly like what they were supposed to look like. Gerald still lives in Detroit. He and his wife kept the house, barely. His daughter moved back home to help. He takes his wife to medical appointments on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He makes coffee in the morning and checks his bank account, a habit he's never been able to shake. He doesn't think about Marcus Webb very often. He says, there's no point. What he thinks about is the quarterly statement, the one that arrived every 3 months for 9 years, his name at the top, a balance figure that turned out to be fiction. He thinks about how many times he held it in his hands and felt relieved, secure, taken care of. They used trust as the weapon, he said once. That's what I can't get past. It wasn't some stranger who broke into my house. I let them in. I invited them in, because the whole thing was designed so I would. He's right. And that's the part that doesn't get resolved with an indictment. Somewhere right now, pension fund managers are reviewing statements that look exactly like Gerald's did. Quarterly, professionally formatted, bearing the names of real companies. Signed by people with impressive titles and photographs on lobby walls. Some of those statements are accurate. Some of them are not. The terrifying part, the part regulators will acknowledge privately but rarely say publicly, is that distinguishing between the two is harder than it should be. Even now, even after Detroit, even after the reforms and the indictments and the $340 million in settlements, the architecture of trust is also the architecture of fraud. They are built from the same materials. They look identical from the outside. The only difference is what's happening behind the door. And by the time you find out the door is already locked, the office is already closed, and the note on the glass says temporarily. But we both know what that word really means.